Hi everyone, and a very warm welcome to our very first Porsche Heritage Talk. My name is Astrid and I will be your host for the next hour. We know that it's still a very difficult time right now, and most of us are facing a new lockdown, the same here in Germany from Wednesday on. So believe me when I say we would rather have met you here in person than only just digitally. So we are very pleased to have you here and that you are joining us. You might have probably recognized in the background where we are. Indeed, it is the warehouse of our corporate collection. Behind me, you get a little impression of our collection that counts more than 700 historical cars. And among them, we have a big choice of different series models from our today's main actor. In 2021, we are going to honor the 25th anniversary of the Boxster. We assume that you might be quite familiar with the history of the Boxster, but I am pretty sure that you agree when I say that listening to former decision makers and contemporary witnesses is much more exciting than just reading about them in a book, right? At the beginning of the 90s, Porsche was facing not an easy task. It was the time of launching a new generation next to the icon, the 911. Then and now, tradition and evolution should be in harmony as best as possible. And above all, it was about saving the company, saving Porsche. It was the most difficult period for Porsche from an economic point of view. Today, we would like to look back to the beginning of the Boxster and the turnaround with two interview partners. I'm very much looking forward to talk to Grant Larson, who is not only responsible for the concept of for the design of the concept car that was being introduced in 1993 in Detroit. It's also him who designed the first generation, the 986, that conquered the world in 1996. I would like to start this talk with Horst Marchart, Executive Board Member of Research and Development at that time. It was him, together with his colleagues, who paved the way for the Boxster and who presented a new strategy to rescue Porsche. Just a little hint before I start. You can already send your question in the chat for our Q&A session at the end of our talk. Hello,
Mr. Marchart. Great that you joined us this afternoon. Thank you. Mr. Marchart, you're a dyed-in-the-wool Porsche man, and I'm sure that you would agree with me. You've spent more than 40 years with Porsche and for Porsche. Please give us a quick rundown of your career at Porsche for a start. Well, I started working for Porsche in 1960 as a young engineer, and I think that was just the right time because we started developing the 911. At that time, I worked in the engine development department until 1964. And then after 1964, and then I moved on to a special and third-party engineering department because there was more new development activities there than in the series production support. And later on, I also worked in the third-party engineering unit. So that means I spent about 20 years at Porsche, having, however, worked primarily for external parties until then. And then in 1988, I came back to our internal development department, where I became the head of department for the overall vehicle development at that time. And then 3 years later, in 1991, I was appointed a board member. Before that, however, I had to tell the supervisory board what I wanted to do if I became a board member, which I did. So I became a member of the executive board. Now, at that time, around 1988, 1989, where you were head of the overall vehicle development department and then also became a board member, can you briefly tell us what situation Porsche was facing in that time? Because it was a make-or-break time, wasn't it? Yes, indeed. It already started actually in 1984, but it really got worse towards the end of the 1980s. Sales of Porsche vehicles dropped down to 15,000 units per year. Before that, we had sold about 40,000 cars per year. And we also had a lot of fluctuation on the management team. And the development projects which were proposed at that time for new vehicles, now it was obvious that this would not be expedient, and in that situation we were asked to develop a concept for a new 911 and also a second model series, the Boxster, very much based upon the very same parts. Now, we will talk about that in a minute, but first let me ask you, what was the mood, the feeling like at Porsche? Well, of course, the workforce felt a lot of uncertainty. We tried to improve the car all the time, but this did not manifest itself in a success on the market. I mean, the cars always looked more or less the same. They were improved, technically speaking, but at the end of the day, they became more and more expensive, and these were general times of a crisis in the economy, and so there was a lot of uncertainty amongst everybody, the entire workforce. And then, when we said we want to develop the 911 and the Boxster, the people still were somewhat skeptical whether we were betting on the right horse at that time. But then we shipped a model or kind of a prototype to the US, to the motor show there, where it turned out to be a great success, and then gradually confidence in the workforce also improved. But before going to Detroit in the first place, there was still the idea of a four-seater Porsche, the 989. And you told us a few minutes ago that before you were appointed board member, you also had to explain your strategy to the supervisory board about your strategy, how to rescue the company. Well, my plan was the following. I said the 924 or the 944 and the 928, both of which didn't earn us any money, but they rather consumed any money. So we had already been developing the 911, that is the 993, but it still took some time until it had reached its SOP. And well, then the 989 was even above the 911 in terms of pricing and the 928. And in the situation we were facing at that time, that was a concept which was not expedient at all, because people were not even willing or interested to purchase the vehicles which we had already been producing at that time. So my idea was to go back to the roots. I said, let's go back to zero with a costly, efficient 911. So we didn't want to reduce its technical detail, but we want to build it at lower costs and then develop the Boxster with a common parts strategy. So basically, you reset everything to zero, back to square one. Now, how difficult was it to convince the executive board and the supervisory board of this new strategy? Well, the supervisory board, they approved the concept rather quickly, and they then asked me to do a feasibility check, or whether it also would work from a logical point of view. And Mr. Wiedeking, Mr. Laxi, and I on the executive board, we discussed this also with our financial department, and I think there was a gap of almost 1 billion in that time in terms of the cost calculation. Well, and earning 1 billion was quite a lot of money at that time. So we got the thumbs up, but nevertheless, when we started implementing the project, further difficulties arose. We had to optimize everything, we had to reduce the workforce to survive in the first place, and for that reason, the 993 was the only car left of the family of air-cooled vehicles. We did some further special models to survive that 1 year until the SOP of the 986, which was the Boxster. And then we had 2 model lines which we felt would rescue us, would allow us to recover. And then 1 year later we also launched the 911. And then at that time, with these 2 model lines and with the recovery of the economy, we felt that we were out of the woods gradually. Well, I think we can tell that it still moves you very much. It was also hard to fight for the success of the company. Well, we were so much involved in our work that we didn't even think about that. We were just happy later on when we succeeded. Well, and we can only congratulate you and all your colleagues on this, the colleagues you just mentioned, because otherwise we probably wouldn't be sitting here. I mean, this even gives me the shivers now. Mr. Marchart, you told me that when you were able to convince the executive board and your colleagues, now you said at that time every board member, every department worked quite efficiently, but they did not really work as a team. The team effort was missing. So which levers did you tackle to overcome this kind of a silo approach? Well, I've got to take it one step back. The Porsche company used to be a company with one boss at the very top, namely Professor Porsche. And then it became a publicly listed company. And then, of course, we had an executive board, and every board member, well, they had their specific department properly under control. So the head of development built the car. Then he invited his colleague from production and told him, look at this car, please manufacture this car. And when they were done, they went up to the head of sales and told him, now sell that car. Now, when we started working on these two model lines, we rather set up 21 teams in development. But these teams not only consisted of people from the development department, but these were cross-functional teams from all other departments as well. So we had a cross-departmental communication at that time already. And for example, we created a fictitious 911 bill of materials, and we asked the people from purchasing and from production to tell us about the costs, and we rather told them then how high can the maximum prices for every single price and part and component be to reach the final target of a 30% price reduction. Now, that was a tough struggle, but we succeeded at the end of the day. Well, yes, and then you talked about the study going to Detroit. Why Detroit in the first place? Well, if I remember it well, then at that time we exported 60% of the cars we built to the US. And of course, in that case, you really would want to ask those customers whether they like what we are going to offer them. And they said, well, we like it, and so we went for it. Yeah, I mean, it was a great response from the media after the presentation in Detroit. It was overwhelmingly positive. And then when you came back to Weissach, now, it was obvious. We were going to go for it. We're building the Boxster. Now, what were the first steps? What did you tackle first? Well, at that time, we didn't even have the specifications yet. So we got together, we generated the specifications, we got the bill of materials, and then we selected the major components, the engines, and we also analyzed the technologies we wanted to use for manufacturing. At that time, there was also the idea of doing it in all aluminum, and then we realized we wouldn't have the time to do it in all aluminum in the very short time available, so we stuck to steel. And then we had also test programs. So before the start of production, all of the tests had already been performed on the prototypes, and positive results, of course, had been obtained. And I think the employees, they had also fun in doing that. I mean, they worked extra hours out of their own voluntarily, and there were some people who even clocked out, and then they came back to work again. And I think that was even filed with the police. A claim was filed there. And well, if really that fine had been imposed upon me, I would have been forced to pay 50,000 euros or something. So I was lucky at that time. Well, now, what did the specifications then specifically say in the final analysis? Those specs. Well, in the specifications, you describe all of the characteristics and everything you need to do in in production, for example, and our after-sales department, for example, they even specified the maximum duration of the maintenance intervals, and of course this also provided valuable assistance to the workshops, allowing them to complete their repairs faster and thus earning more money than before. Now, how did it happen that the Boxster was launched with a 6-cylinder engine? Because I think the specifications also included the option of a 4-cylinder engine, and there was also the possibility of having the engine manufactured by Audi. Well, the specifications said that in contrast to the 911 with its 6 cylinders, we launched the Boxster with a 4-cylinder engine. Now, at that time I was not too happy about that idea and decision, but we definitely want to have a different kind of an output level between these two model lines. And if we had gone for 2 6-cylinder engines for the 2 model lines, then at some point people would have said that's going to get too expensive. We can't do it. So I agreed. But then, of course, if you want to have the possibility of later on equipping the car with a 6-cylinder engine, then you of course have to provide the necessary packaging space for that purpose. Well, and we did, and we said yes, that would be possible. So we asked Audi how much would it cost us to purchase that kind of an engine from you, and the amount which they quoted or which they offered us was so high. I mean, for the base engine, we would have paid as much as we would have needed for developing the entire 6-cylinder Boxer engine. And so Mr. Wiedeking and I, we got together and we said, we come up with a 6-cylinder with a reduced displacement, and then the advantage is that in contrast to BMW and Daimler, we're not going to have a 4-cylinder engine, but a 6-cylinder at that time already. Well, that was the pragmatic Swabian solution then, wasn't it? Now, in general, how did you deal with the immense pressure on costs during that period? Well, we really had to count every single penny, because making things more expensive is always much easier than saving costs. Now, the concept of common parts or carryover parts, namely with the 911 and the Boxster being developed in parallel and using similar parts, what exactly does this mean? Well, when that decision was taken, we didn't have the Boxster yet. I just told the supervisory board we're going to take a 911, and then we come up with a new car which will have the identical front end, and what we're going to vary is the mid-engine concept, which we're going to attach to that identical front end. Of course, that's easier said than done. Yes, but we still got it done, and the 2 model lines then have about 50% carryover parts. The costs were a bit lower then. So the manufacturing costs. Here the savings were a bit less. Now, looking back onto those years, where it was a struggle for survival for Porsche. How do you feel about that time? Happy or sad? Well, in the very beginning, we were happy that we had managed to reach our targets in terms of costs and deadlines. And today, I'm glad to see that the car is still around. Yes, and it is still a popular car indeed.
Herr Marchart, thank you very much for this, for the moment. Now we would like to continue with Grant Larson and how the designers developed the Boxster. Grant, great to have you here today. Thank you very much.
It's good to be here.
Porsche keeps you young, obviously. You've been with the brand more than 3 decades. When and how you came to Porsche, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Boxster wasn't your first project, right?
That's correct. I first came to Porsche in 1989 after 3 years at Audi. And Audi in Munich, and had some good friends that were working at BMW Technik, and I heard through the rumor grapevine was that Dr. Ulrich Bates, as well as Harm Lagai, will be leaving BMW Technik and coming to start something new at Porsche, and I became very interested. And that's what drew me to Porsche. It took a long while before we began something that really took hold. And the first project, one of them was the 944 facelift, which eventually became the 968, as well as the 989.
When you joined Porsche in 1989, the company wasn't in a healthy situation. What was your view of the company, especially as a young designer at age 32?
Well, at that time, the designers, you always look at places where a lot of things are going on. At that time, it was in Japan, there was a lot of things going on, a lot of show cars, a lot of development. There's a little bit less going on in Europe, and the least was happening at Porsche. Porsche was known in the industry from a design standpoint as a company which just facelifted a model for decades, and that was really not a proper job for a designer there. That was the feeling back then.
Let's start with the concept car. You were a very small design team. Can you tell me a little bit about the process? How did you work together?
Yeah. Well, when we first started the Boxster, of course, we were a bit down because the 989 had just been canceled. That was in around the middle or fall of 91 or so. But we knew something new was coming. So when we first started with the idea of the Boxster, of course, together with the 911, it was an exciting moment for us because you're switching from a front-engine 4-seater Porsche to a mid-engine 2-seater Porsche. So the emotions were quite high. You also had, as far as the overall feeling at the time, there was a lot of hope that this time we were going to get it right. So as a designer always says, the first idea starts with a sketch, a pencil and a piece of paper, and that's basically how it all started. And of course, once you have it sketched out, this is before any type of digital modeling or anything. You work with a modeler, and you basically just tell them how it should look, and then it just sort of falls together. That's in a nutshell.
Okay, because it sounds so easy. You just mentioned it. How did you draw the inspiration for the Boxster?
Yeah, well, Porsche has a very strong mid-engine history going way back. But if you stick with just the roadsters and leave off the early stuff from the 30s, there was a lot of gorgeous cars that we had produced, the 550 being the first racing-specific Porsche, specifically intended for racing, and its successor, which is 718 RSK, and of course, don't forget the 914. So Porsche had a lot of mid-engine history to build on.
Mm-hmm. To come back to the process, did you go from pen and paper renderings to clay model, or how?
Well, sort of. These days we have a real digital process, and there's a lot of things that take place on computers. But it doesn't seem like that was that long ago. But still, it seems like nearly 25 years ago, is that the whole process was very analog. So I was really lucky to have an older gentleman who had a lot of experience in automotive, like clay modeling. All our models at the beginning are made out of clay. And instead of having to draw sections on a wall and these big giant tape drawings I think some people are familiar with, where you're taking X, Y, Z coordinates and putting them on the car, and then after 2 weeks you think you might have something you like. This guy just said, well, Grant, just give me a sketch. How you want this car to look. So I'm going oh, okay, well, this is a different system. So I plastered the walls with all these drawings that how I imagined the car could look, and of course talked to my boss, and you have a lot of inspiration from the other teams and everything. And so one by one, we went through those sketches, and with the Harm Lagai at the time, and we put little red dots on each of the areas of those sketches that we thought that could become the new Boxster. And then this Peter Muller, the guy, he just walked up to it and looked at the drawing, went over to the clay model and started sculpting it with this thing which looks like cheese graters. And the car just blossomed from his hands. Not only from my sketches, but from his hands. It was an excellent process, very good memories of that.
Sounds great, yes. How did the crisis influence your work? Did you feel under pressure, or was it the other way around?
Oh, terribly, yeah. Well, after the demise of the 989, you had even more. You think, well, how are we going to, kind of set foot, and how are we going to get things going? We have to have a hit because you have the responsibility of resurrecting the company. It's not only you yourself as a reputation. You don't look at it like that, or your department. You just look at the whole company. It was very important for us to make the very best out of this opportunity, and I think we did. We worked really hard. We put ourselves under a lot of pressure. And eventually we managed.
So how would you describe how was the atmosphere at that time within the team, the design team?
Well, it was two different atmospheres. There was the people who had been there longer and that had seen a few failed attempts, and like Horst Marchart was saying, we had some management changes, so that brought an additional insecurity. But at the same time, you had this vision that this new 911 developed together with the new Boxster could really become something. So with that thought, it kind of gave us drive.
Great. Can you show us some highlights on the concept car?
Well, I'll try to explain very briefly. I'll probably need an hour for this, but I'll do my best. But basically, anytime we describe a design, it's all about it's the proportions and the feeling, the overall feeling that the car gives. In the case of the Boxster, whether it's a Boxster, the old one, the new one, back to the 550s or 718 RSKs, it's like this inherent form language that we always build upon, always in a more modern way. In the case of this Boxster, what we typical of a mid-engine car, mid-engine proportions, it's a longer wheelbase. The cabin is a little bit further forward, and you have, of course, these wonderfully sculpted fender bulges, what do you want to call them? Low bonnet, and continuing off to the side. We had a lot of sculpture going on the side. This is before we knew we had to carry over a lot from the 996. In the interior, there's about 2 hours worth of explanation to go into this thing, but basically the idea is from Stefan Stark. We worked in tandem on that, and the idea was to bring a little bit of more body color into the car and to have a driver-oriented seating. So the car is basically asymmetrical. So you have a tighter seating position with these side bolsters that hold onto your hips. On the passenger side, it's a little bit more relaxed with a little bit more space because all they have to do is hang on. With all kinds of wonderful little details. And one of the ones that's most famous, that it sticks in everyone's minds since 1993, are the moving ventilator fans. Those, unfortunately, did not make it into production. But going towards the back, it's the similar what I was saying before, the low rear deck and the higher fenders, just to give it the feeling of a real tightness. I always referred to, whether it's a Boxster or some of the early predecessors, it's like it's a car where its body is sort of stretched over the car's mechanical components. So it keeps the fenders kind of like sticking out in wheels and showing the wheels real strongly.
Cool. Unfortunately, it was also the time saving or reducing costs. What contribution did you make in the design to help reducing the costs?
Yeah, as we know that every development of a product in a team, you're not as a designer doing your own personal dream, but you're working with a team. The car has to be produced, it has to be marketed, it has to be manufacturable. In the case of the Boxster, we have several carryover parts from the 996. That was very important to take over. In the case of the packaging, we were required for safety reasons to, of course, integrate a roll bar, which is kind of like a no-brainer, and to make some of the areas of the car a little bit more voluptuous, a little bit bigger to accept the radiators, which come from the 996, as well as have like a proper trunk front and rear. So those are the compromises that changed the package. One small compromise, I wouldn't say a compromise, but it was very important that as the project was developing, we were looking more and more how to save even more costs. So what we learned from previous projects, also like the 989, we had to put into this car, for example, this so-called modular headlamp. And that saved us a lot of money because not only of getting all the functions in one element, but also to make it very easy and fast, especially fast to produce. Because time on the production line was also money.
Yes. To me, it looks still timeless. Wonderful concept car. The production version of the Boxster remains surprisingly close to the concept study.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about it and show us some examples?
Well, we did our best to translate as much of the show car into the production car. And like I was talking before about making a few compromises, it's a part of life, that's what it's about. But we think we maintained a lot of the character from the show car into the production car, mainly being like the higher fenders. We call this, even on today's cars, the topography of the car, where you have the higher fenders and the lower bonnet carrying through to the lower windscreen. The Boxster windscreen, of course, is lower than the 996, more of a sporty feel. Side intakes, of course, are a little bit different than the show car, but I think everyone heard that story. If not, we can get into that again. Show car did not have a roof. Here we have a proper roof for the everyday use thing and a proper trunk, and of course a rear spoiler. One thing I'm quite happy about on the Boxster is that you're always looking for things from the past that you could develop into the future, like these iconic elements from the previous Spyders, which is the central, they call it in English, called pea shooter exhaust pipe, and because of the way the engine was laid out and the two cylinder banks come together in these exhaust pipes and they exit in the middle. That's something we had in the show car and also managed to get that in the production car.
You just mentioned the 550. How did tradition, and maybe still does, impact the design for the Boxster?
Yeah, the 550 is famous for a lot of reasons. It's an iconic car that showed up in a lot of films. Of course, the whole James Dean story and everything. It's that basic form philosophy carried to a new era. It's the low bonnets, front and rear, and the higher fenders. Round elements and headlamps, lowish windscreen. It's all those little characteristics we like to carry in.
The Boxster was expected to be an honest Porsche. What would you say? How did you achieve this claim?
Honest.
Honest.
Well, I think honest is a good way to express. So like keeping a car in its design authentic. Authenticity is one of my favorite words. And that everything is there for a specific reason and a function. So what you're doing is basically taking that stylistically to a new level to make it so like sporty and dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Which details about the Boxster do you like best, and why?
I think if you want to focus on one detail, it's that central exhaust, because we had it in our past, and we brought it up into the future, and nobody else had it.
Last question from my side. How do you look back on the project today?
I look back on the project as if it was a very tough time. I think it's one of those things when you're younger, you have nothing better to do but to work like crazy and try to establish your career. But at the same time, it was very important to do something for Porsche as a company, and it was a great honor. Great honor.
Great honor. Thank you, Grant, for your insights. I would like to have you now joining me, Horst Marchart, because now we are going to answer your questions. If you still haven't had the chance to visit the Porsche Museum, and let's hope that this will be possible or traveling will be easy again in 2021, there is a good reason to come to Zuffenhausen then, because from March 13 on we will display a special exhibition to honor the 25th anniversary of the Boxster. So please feel free, let us know your questions, because now we start our Q&A session. So let's see.
The first question is for both of you. Now, looking at all Boxster generations and variants of the last 25 years, if you were to select only one model, which one would you go for and why? First to you, Mr. Marchart. I would go for the very first one. Why is that so? Because that was the start of it all. And it's very dear to my heart, of course, that very first one.
What's your choice, Grant?
I partially agree. I would take an early Boxster S, and I did because I own two of them. Price was really good. But if I was to add another car, my ultimate Boxster is the 987 based Boxster Spider. The reasons for that is because of its character. It was one of my projects that I also worked on, and it was also we really tried to do this consequent sort of lightweight and a minimal roof. And it really took that Boxster to a higher performance, lightweight level.
Yeah, you're a big fan of lightweight, I know.
Now, how did you come up with the name Boxster? Well, that was an invention, I think, of our styling department. We talked about a possible name we would wanted to propose, and the gentlemen then they got together and they combined the two words of the Boxer engine and the Speedster model, and then patched these together, and it became the Boxster. Yes, and without any consultants that we had to hire.
Yeah, it is.
Yes, once again, you saved money. Very good.
Money. It's all about saving money.
One more question for you, Mr. Marchart. What's the legacy of the Boxster for Porsche? And apart from the financial aspect, how did it change the company? Well, I think the diversity of models which we had in the company, the 944, the 928, the 911, and with the new 989 which had been planned. Now that was a collection of cars, but all sold in very low numbers. Good cars, but still making money with that would be difficult, and that was the root cause for the problems of the company. So we had to try to find the ways and means to sell at least 30,000 units per year again.
Grant, a question for you. Can you explain us the difference between the meaning Spider and Speedster? I think one is related to the Boxster and the other one to the 911 Cabriolet, right?
Well, the Speedster is it's a model name for a car. It's a model name, a derivative of a 911, and Speedsters have let's see, going back to the 356. It's always been like the Speedster. Spider is to me like a derivative. In the case of the Spider, it's always an open top mid-engine car.
In another question for you, oh, sorry.
Yes, well, here we've got one, says Mr. Marchart.
In translating the concept car into the production Boxster, what was the biggest challenge, would you say?
I think a lot of things had to do with the component sharing with 911 that came afterwards. We had to share things like the front bonnet. That wasn't such a big deal, but the doors, which kind of neutralized our theme. So what we take away from one car, you basically give to the other. So that's what I'm always saying. You don't make a compromise for visual reasons. You make a compromise in respect for the car that's coming out afterwards.
Mr. Marchart, another question for you. Why did you build first the Boxster and then the 911 1 year later? Well, our sales activities had more or less collapsed to 15 to 20,000 units sold per year. And according to the plans we had at that time, we would have had only the 993 as a model, which was still under development. And the second model had to help the company survive until the new 911 and the Boxster together would produce the required units to be sold. Then we did some further special models for the 993, like the glass roof. We said it's going to be a special roof, which then was later launched as the Carrera. And that's why we said we're not going to launch the leading development car, the 911, first, because then we would have more or less had two identical cars, the 993 and the 996, but we rather went for the Boxster. And the customers saw that new car first, and they liked it. And we didn't even have to explain to them that they're almost identical. But when the 911 was then launched later on, well, then it was obvious there were a couple of things which the 911 customers liked better or worse, but nobody realized that the front ends were identical between the Boxster and the 911. And once again, the entire company had a single line and a single concept encompassing the entire portfolio.
Grant, I have another one for you. Did the Boxster influence also the design of the 996?
Did influence of the 996? Mm-hmm. Yes, it did. As we were developing both cars at the identical time. We had similar gates, like milestones with the project, but the 911 was to come out later. So that's like what I said before about the doors and the basic proportions of the car, geometry of the windscreen. We were sharing a lot within those cars. I wouldn't say influencing, but sharing.
Mm-hmm.
This is true.
Yes, that's indeed true, said Mr. Marchart.
Oh, tough question. Whoops. What about the next 25 years from the design point of view? What should we expect for the Boxster in 2045?
We've just finished that car. No, I'm just kidding. Well, I have a pretty good idea as to what the next generation Boxster looks like because it's on the measuring plate in our studio, and our goal is to I'll say it this way: our goal was always to use the Boxster to take bigger developmental steps as far as design and styling goes, whereas the 911 has always been very successful with its evolutionary track. In the case of the Boxster, we're taking bigger steps. So that's what our plan will be to do in the future, is to take bigger and more daring steps.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Marchart, didn't you worry at that time that a lower cost sports car would hurt the image of Zuffenhausen? No. Now, initially, we wanted to have the Boxster in order to reach out to a younger target group, and thus to attract other customers to our company than if you try to sell the 911. And important gentlemen in the company said, why are we doing the Boxster? Why can't we take the 911 then turn it into a two-seater and different kind of a top, and then we can sell it as well, and then at even a lower cost? But I think that would not have been a new model line, but it would just have been a derivative of the 911. And of course, I think if a customer says, I'm going for the 911, I'm going for the original, the true one, and not some derivative, which would have then have been called 912 or whatever. Now, there's another question for both of you again. Can you please tell us about the tough timeline at that time in terms of development? That was quite ambitious, wasn't it? Yes, indeed. At that time, it was called... At that time we said, usually takes 3 years to build such a car, and we said we're going to reduce it to 24 months. And I went to Japan with some people from McKinsey and talked to some experts there, and then, we revealed their secret, because in Japan, they kind of played around with the start, with the time which they call the start of development. And we really started from scratch. We had nothing. We had no drawings, no sketches, nothing at all. We only had the old 911, of course. But in Japan, they had some advanced development activities which they did not include in this time calculation. And the people at Honda, at that time, they built the first production cars with prototype tools. And only when everything was right there, then they produced new production tools. But then for the media, they said it took us 24 months, but that was not true. Now, what memories do you have of testing and development? Now, did ever any things go wrong before you had the production car? Well, of course, in development, of course, the point of what you do there is to develop a car. And except for two things, we were able to complete the car without major issues. When we presented the car in the Alps at the Jungfernjoch, we presented the car in an igloo. It was cold there, we opened up the roof, so that barely worked, and when we wanted to close the roof again, well, these were plastic parts, and temperature was minus 40 degrees C, so the plastic got stuck and the roof didn't close anymore. And then we had a similar problem when we presented the car to our sales organization in the US. The shift linkage, which is also a plastic adapter in the linkage, and it was too hot at that time, but that was not tested for high temperatures, but it was not done so for coincidence. And well, then a modification was done on the exhaust system, which was then also tested, but the shift linkage was not tested, and then a little adapter broke on that linkage. But these were just a few cars where we remedied the situation with metal parts, and then we implemented the full change in our production system. So these were still prototypes where these things had gone wrong at that time.
Grant, are there any parts overall Boxster generation that are styled to be unique to the Boxster only?
Is it throughout all generations?
Yeah. I don't know, you just make it easier, but yeah.
Well, there's a couple of things. If you look at the overall shape of the car, it's overall, I'd say, proportions that we try to maintain throughout the generations. But otherwise, it's it's like it depends upon which derivative. It's the center-mounted rear tailpipe, which not all of them have. Side air intake, which is typical mid-engine character, and but otherwise, we just develop the form language as it goes throughout the generations, and always look for something new.
You wanted to add something, Mr. Marchart? Anything that makes the Boxster so unique? Yes, with the Boxster and also with the 911, there was one major change that we applied, namely the air-cooled engine was replaced by a water-cooled engine. And of course, for that purpose, for the water-cooled engine, we also needed a radiator, which we didn't have for the air-cooled one. And in the beginning, we received, we had the idea of having the radiator in front of the front tires, the left and the right front tire. Now that was included in the initial package, but then supplier told us, well, they can't do it in full production volumes. We need to come up with some new idea and design it as well. And that really was a big issue at that time, because at that time we feared that we would have to do the entire styling over again, because we would have been forced to change the front end. But we managed and then resolved the problem with a standard radiator and an additional cooling concept, but that was critical. That would have meant that we could not have maintained the timeline anymore.
Thank you very much for your memories, for your deep insights. I could listen to you for hours, honestly, but we have to come to an end. So thank you very much to you both. And thank you very much to you out there, so to say. Please take care of you. We would like to share with you much more moments of Porsche's history. So thank you very much for your attention, for your interest. And bye-bye und auf Wiedersehen.